So we were talking about the trilemma and how you cannot have all three objectives. And here I want to give you examples of what I mean by that. So this is a case of China. China is your classic, this question came about China. China, basically what it does is, the left chart shows you pretty much has had a constant exchange rate, except last year they had a lot of turmoil, June 16, but until then they pretty much had a steady exchange rate. And notice that despite having a steady exchange rate, they were able to vary their interest rate quite a bit on the right-hand side chart. Now, the reason they could do that was because, they were not constrained by capital flowing in whenever they changed their interest rates. So China is a good example. Remember, in all of this, I am simplifying because China actually has multiple instruments of monetary policy. They do all kinds of things. They have reserve requirements. They have different interest rates for different, target groups and so on. But broadly, what you have to take away from this is that China solves the trilemma, or has solved until recently. Again, they've also been progressively opening up their capital account, but it's a relatively closed capital account. And the reason they do that is because they wanted to manage the exchange rate and they wanted to manage their own interest rates. And this is how they've pulled it off. On the other hand, we have India. Especially in the 2000s, mid-2000s, when we had all this money coming into India, essentially we faced the trilemma in a very classic way. So in this period, this is the peak of the boom, you see this means that the exchange rate is becoming stronger. So what happened was that when the Fed cut its interest rate, as it was cutting interest rates, we know that what happened. We know that that expelled capital all over the world. And as a result of that, money kept flowing in, also because India was growing very strongly. And we started getting very uncomfortable with this rupee appreciating, precisely because when the rupee appreciates, your exports are affected, employment gets affected. So in a sense, what we had to do was pretty much mimic what the Fed was doing. So if they cut rates, we had to follow their rates. So this is an example where you lose independence over your own monetary policy. And as a result of that, of course, inflation took off. Remember that you want independent monetary policy to control your inflation, but essentially inflation starts taking off because you want to try and keep the exchange rate from becoming very strong. And the only way you can do that, if you have an open capital account, is if the Fed is cutting its interest rates, you have to follow suit. Otherwise, the capital flow problem gets very, very difficult to manage. And so this is an example of, losing a monetary policy independence if you have an open capital account. So the way you do it is, you basically say, I give up on inflation control and I give up on having my own monetary policy. The third example of the trilemma is if you want, and this is the Brazilian case, notice how on the left-hand side, Brazil has kept inflation down by changing its monetary policy. And Brazil is an open capital account. Money keeps coming in. If interest rates come down, money goes out. Interest rates go up, money comes in. And basically, they have abandoned a target. You see there on the right-hand side, the Brazilian exchange rate has become stronger and stronger. So essentially, they've lost control of exchange rates. And in fact, I would say that most advanced countries around the world essentially are in this. They have no restrictions on capital coming in and out. They try and keep monetary policy independent because they have their own inflation target to meet. And the way they do it is to say, if the exchange rate goes up, that's it. It goes up, it goes down. We don't care that much about it, and we will let this happen. So this is how the international trilemma is managed by different groups of countries. Now, suppose in the Indian case, yeah, question?
This, when the economy was on move, we had a perfect capital mobility. We discussed it, but there was no, in many sectors there was a restriction.
So,
So what is the meaning from your perspective when you say there was a perfect capital mobility?
see, again, all of you, I mean, forgive my saying, you have a tendency to interpret things very rigidly. When I say a perfect capital mobility, it means, it obviously I don't mean any capital can come anywhere at any point in time, but there's, it's open enough for capital to come in and flow in response to all these interest rate movements and so on. So there are still in India restrictions, for example, on how much money can come into bond markets, how much money can come into corporate bond markets as well. But in terms of equities, money can come in, and ECBs, we've been allowing borrowing limits to expand. So effectively, there's a lot of capital coming in, enough for this trilemma to be a real problem, i.e. for the exchange rate to get out of control. So what are possible strategies that countries do? In India, for example, how do we solve this? And this is exactly what, sometimes we impose capital controls. If, for example, Brazil, what it did was, in around 2009, 2010, you saw the currency was becoming very, very strong in response to capital inflows. So they imposed taxes on foreign money coming in. So that's a way of addressing the problem. You don't want too much money. So essentially what capital controls do is they try and break the link between returns on foreign assets and returns on domestic assets. So by imposing a tax, you reduce the, if you were to bring money in, you'll actually get less returns than the interest rate because you have to pay taxes. You try and control it that way. The other thing that countries do is when money comes in, the central bank, in order to prevent the exchange rate from going up, they start buying the dollars. Now, so you buy dollars, you prevent the exchange rate from appreciating, but there are two things that happen. Why you can't do this forever? When you buy dollars, that means you actually are injecting liquidity into the market. So you can do it up to a point, because beyond a point, if liquidity keeps coming into the market, then again that will affect inflation and spending and so on. So that's not something that you can do forever. That has limited thing. So then what countries do is that they buy the dollars, and then they what you call sterilize it. That is, they issue bonds to suck the liquidity that they've. So you buy dollars, you inject liquidity into the market, but then you sell bonds and suck the liquidity out of the market. But then when you then sell these bonds, that again puts pressure on interest rates to go up, and the same problem emerges again, because when interest rates start going up, more money starts coming in. So there is no perfect solution, or really a solution to this trilemma problem if you have open capital accounts. You just have to do what the RBI and many banks end up doing, is to do a little bit of capital controls, a little bit of intervention, a little bit of sterilization, and hope that, show a picture of Lord Krishna, hope that, it all works out. And sometimes it does, sometimes, of course, it doesn't. Now, this is where I want to take you through this chart very carefully, because this is a chart which I wrote down summarizing, who wants what, how to understand how market participants think about interest rates and exchange rates. So there are three columns, which is the group, what is their preference and why. So the first group is manufacturers in the country. We know very clearly they want low interest rates because they want to borrow cheap. They also want a weak currency because for two reasons. They can export more. Also very important that when the exchange rate depreciates, they get protection against foreign competition. So if I am producing and selling, say, steel, which is competing with Chinese steel, I want a competitive exchange rate. So that's what manufacturers want. Domestically oriented firms, so they want low interest rates. And they may not care about the currency because they don't really sell things abroad, or they don't really sell things that compete with imports. So they want, just low interest rates. Infrastructure companies, very, very interesting infrastructure companies, and you will see this, it happened in the 2007-8 period. They want, what do they want? They want a strong currency. Why? They borrow in dollars. So they borrow in dollars, and therefore, if the dollar remains strong, if the rupee remains strong, they have to pay fewer rupees to repay their debts. But there's another reason why they want they don't mind a strong currency.
Interest payments.
No, because remember that infrastructure, what they sell is a non-tradable. It doesn't compete with imports or anything like that. So that's why they don't care about the competition effect from what they sell. And in fact, because they buy also mostly imported inputs, they want a strong currency. So they want a strong currency because they borrow in dollars, they buy imported inputs, and what they sell is not in competition with anything from abroad. And so this is in fact, the power sector is a very good example of that, where they really want a strong currency. And that is very interesting to observe in terms of how, their impact on policy. Households, we've said very clearly, even I get Twitter messages saying, don't you care about households, you want lower interest rates, the value of my savings come down. And you can see why that's the case. And in the case of households, remember that they are probably more saving than borrowing. Because if you were borrowing, you'd like low rates, but if you're saving, if you're a net saver, you would like a higher interest rate. So that's the kind of thing. Equity investors, very interesting. Domestic, clearly they want low interest rates. So, if you're buying shares in the stock market, you want low rates, because lower the rate, more the profits, cheaper the borrowing cost for firms, higher the profits, and therefore stock prices will go up and you'll be very happy. Foreign investors, they also want low interest rates, but they want a strong currency. Why do they want a strong currency? Because when they take their money out, they will get more returns in dollars. So that is why they want a strong currency. But of course, remember that a low interest and a strong currency will not always necessarily go together. There's a tension between the two, because if you have a low interest rate, the likelihood will be for the currency to weaken. Bond investors are the most tricky characters, I think. Not the domestic ones. The domestic ones, clear, they want falling interest rates. Now, one thing you should remember is that when you think about owning a bond, there are two things that happen, right? You get a coupon, which is the interest rate you get on that. But when you hold a bond, the price of the bond can go up and down. So if interest rates decline, bond prices go up and you make capital gains. So domestic bond investors want falling interest rates. Foreign bond investors, the trickiest characters of them all, they want high and falling interest rates and a strong currency. So they invest money. So this is what is called the carry trade. The carry trade happens when foreign interest rates are low, domestic Indian interest rates are high, and you expect the currency to remain strong, because then you make a lot of money. You make the differential between the two interest rates, and you don't lose money on the depreciation because the currency remains strong. That is what is called the carry trade. And the carry trade was especially, it's a term that's become very significant over the last, almost 7-8 years since the global financial crisis, because US interest rates and foreign interest rates have been virtually zero, and emerging market countries have had substantial positive rates. So that's called the carry trade. Money comes in, and they make the higher return, provided the currency doesn't depreciate. So foreign bond investors, They want high interest rates, but they want interest rates to fall because then they'll also make capital gains on the bonds that they buy and then convert it back in at a favorable exchange rate and take their money back. So they want high but falling interest rates and a strong currency. But of course, again, a falling rate and a strong currency do not always go together. Governments always want low interest rates. And that's why there's always a battle between the government and central banks. Governments, regardless, because remember, governments are always big debtors. Yeah? So they benefit from low interest rates in two ways. They pay less on the thing. And, this obviously no government actually will say this or want this, but if there's a little bit higher inflation, that actually reduces the value of the outstanding liability that they have. So, many governments around the world, especially in the old days, basically use, as I discussed yesterday, use high inflation or some amount of inflation to reduce the value of their debt burden. So I think this could be I've just come to you in a second. I think this could be a really useful teaching device for students, I think. Who likes what and why. And then you can also I think it can make intelligent consumers of students, because when you read the papers, honestly, even now sometimes I get confused as, should interest rates go up or down, and why is someone asking for this? But imagine students, second year, third year students, I think that something like this could be a really good pedagogical device. And I would urge you, and I'm sure you can kind of refine this in your own way, give better examples, maybe give actual real life examples of this happening. And I think it could really be very useful for students. Yeah, sorry, you had a question.
Yeah, so one thing is there's a restriction on foreign investors when they are buying government bonds in India. Is there a restriction?
Yeah.
Because it would have implications.
Yeah. So what has been happening is that there is a limit, and the limit has been consistently being increased over the last few years. I think now it's something like $35 billion annually. The limit is specified in terms of, does anyone know? I think the limit on how much foreigners can buy, it's an annual limit expressed as a percentage of outstanding government holdings or something like that. And I remember the funny thing is that it's expressed in rupee terms, which is a bit odd. You should if you care about dollars, it should be expressed in dollar terms, but around at the moment, over the last 2-3 years, we've kind of increased it by $5 billion every year, and now it's something like $335 billion per year. Yeah.
Can you elaborate on masala bonds? What is the preference of the investors in
So what is a masala bond, right? A masala bond is really, remember that a masala bond is really someone, anyone, it could be an Indian company, in this case it could also be multilateral agencies. The essential thing is that two things. One, it's a bond that's denominated not in dollars but in rupees. So it's like buying a government bond.
Okay.
Yeah. The only difference is that it is raised not in Indian capital markets, but it could also be raised in London, Singapore, etc. So in foreign markets. So in terms of this, I think it pretty much remains pretty much the same.
currency? There is no.
Yeah, exactly. So the currency is it's like buying domestic bond. Yeah, exactly. But by the way, but in principle, you could have rupee denominated masala bonds. So many governments also issue foreign currency denominated bonds as well. There the calculation is different. That's more like borrowing in dollars, and that's different. Any questions? Yeah, please. Yeah.
Sir, when that time will come in Indian economy, when there will be a low interest rate regime? And second question is this, will the low interest regime ensure the growth of economy?
Ensure the growth of?
Economy.
See, the first question you should ask the RBI, it's not a question that, although I sometimes speak out on this issue, that's a question that really now it's the Monetary Policy Committee that decides that. See, but remember that one of the things I want you to keep in mind, at least for conceptual purposes, right, is that, again, this is not a perfect, but see, economics, when you think about economics, you should first think in terms of first principles, and then how you can adapt it. Like, I say perfect capital mobility, and my friend here pounces on me and says, but there are restrictions, not perfect capital mobility. And the reason why is that when we try and think, we want to think in terms of abstract but maybe extreme concepts, because then once you've understood that, then you can see, well, if you tweak, change the assumptions, how things change. But conceptually, so my answer to your question is this. What interest rates can do is stabilize it around the economy. Interest rates per se do not fundamentally change that line. That line which determines the supply capacity of the economy, it depends upon so many things that the government and everyone has to. You need productivity growth, you need a trade, you need labor markets, you need infrastructure, you need ease of doing business. All those things change the supply potential. What interest rates do is it affects spending, and therefore affects demand. It affects demand in the first instance. It doesn't affect supply. So think of this black line as supply, which is much more complicated depending on lots of things, and that wiggly line as demand, which changes with fiscal policy, monetary policy, and so on. So that's the way I think one should think about the economy. And so this is a very roundabout way of saying that interest rates per se will not expand the supply capacity of the economy. You have to do much, much more. One last question. You had a question, and then we move on.
So what I have been wondering in the past also, that when in 2007 Fed was reducing its rates, and when our currency was already appreciated a lot, why we were also reducing the rates? In fact, we should have tried to increase the rates.
Yeah, see, but
maybe because the economic environment was such that we were not in a position to increase the rates, but why we should to reduce the rate? Because this is actually not going to be good for the economy. Given the circumstances.
But that's the point, right? That is exactly the dilemma, that if they had raised rates, or at least one possibility, to control inflation, the carried trade would have gotten worse and more money would have come in. And your exchange rate problem would have gotten worse. So that's the heart of the trilemma, in a sense. And that's why I think they had to juggle all these things. Okay, so now let's come to financial stability objectives. Tomorrow, for example, tomorrow afternoon, we're going to do a whole section on India's twin balance sheet problems, but it's going to be set in the context of all the crises we've had in the past, and to examine how India fits in or doesn't fit in to many of these crises. What kinds of crises, why they happened, what was the origin, what was the manifestation, what was the transmission mechanism, and so on. But remember that central banks also have financial stability objectives. Now, in the run-up to the US financial crisis, in the run-up to the Japanese crisis, even in the run-up to our 2006-07, what was happening was asset prices were rising very, very rapidly. In the case of the US, housing prices were rising very rapidly. In the case of Japan, in the late 70s, late 80s, housing prices were going up, equity prices were going up, land prices were going up as well. So the dilemma then is, should central banks, what should they do about this? And there was a famous kind of Alan Greenspan, who was the US chairman of the central bank for a very, very long time. when this debate was happening as to what should central banks do. Because remember, because of not addressing the housing crisis, we got the global financial crisis, one of the many reasons for that. So the question is, should they have done more to address financial stability concerns? Now, and remember, again, we have this famous Tinbergen problem. They have only one instrument. What can they do? Now we say, no, you do have other instruments. You have prudential and regulatory measures. For example, what Singapore or Hong Kong often do, and what India did under Governor Y.V. Reddy, is that when housing prices start going up, you then say, well, how much you have to put in as your own money, collateral, that has to go up in order to check that. So central banks have that option. But often these may not work, these may not be enough. So the question is, should central banks use interest rate policy to deal with asset price bubbles or not? It's a big debate. I don't want to go into all the details. But essentially, Alan Greenspan said, this is what he said. He said, look, I don't know whether, I cannot judge in advance whether these asset price increases are going to be a bubble or whether they reflect fundamentals. I mean, if house prices go up, sometimes you can say this is too much. For example, now stock prices are going up in India a lot. It's very difficult to say this is enough, too much, too little. He said it's very, very difficult to guess in advance whether these asset prices. So what I will do is this. I'm not going to do really very much to deal with these asset price increases. If something happens afterwards, I will respond to it. It's called the Greenspan put, because what he says is that afterwards, I have all the ammunition to throw at the problem. If something happens, I can lower interest rates and get the economy back again. But I will not and cannot address this ex ante. Of course, because he said that, we had the world's worst crisis, and many people have blamed him for not spotting the housing price bubble. But it's an open question, whether in addition, because at that time, one of my colleagues used to be a former chief economist of the International Monetary Fund. He said, well, if housing prices are going up, I don't care. Raise interest rates as much as you need to prevent the housing bubble, because the costs of having a crisis are probably much more than allowing the crisis to happen in the first place. But these are all very difficult questions, and these are still unsettled questions as well. Let me just finish this and then we can. So I think bottom line is that IT means, inflation targeting means that central banks have an inflation target. It doesn't mean it's their only objective. It means that inflation is the primary objective, and if there are no inconsistencies between this and other objectives, you try and meet other objectives as well. But the inflation objective takes precedence, i.e. if there's a conflict, you have to. In fact, if you read the Indian, the monetary policy legislation in India, it does say that, the central objective, the primary objective will be inflation control, but taking into account the impact on growth. So the Indian law is phrased very much not only inflation, but inflation primary, but having growth as a secondary objective. The Indian law does not have financial stability explicitly or implicitly as an objective. Now, once you agree, you have to find out which measure of inflation to target and what the level should be. In India, actually, when this was being discussed, if you look at the Urjit Patel Committee report, the choice was between the WPI and the CPI. A new inflation series had just come out, CPI new series, and then the pros and cons were whether it should be the WPI. But I think now the debate in India is much more about whether it should be the headline CPI or core CPI. Now, notice how straight away you see the difference between the two. You see CPI headline fluctuates much more, whereas headline is much more stable. I'll just come to that, yeah. So what are the pros and cons of should you do headline or should you do core? Well, I know all of you have strong views. I'm not going to give you my strong views. Again, because there are pros and cons, and this is what students need to know. Please, I hope in class you don't say, you begin by saying, I want core, please don't do that. In fact, there's a very interesting story. So in the US, there are, I think, 12 people who vote on interest rates. It's called the Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC. So I'm going to test each of you to see whether you're Alan Greenspan or Ben Bernanke. And you know what the difference is? When they used to decide on the vote on the interest rate committee, Alan Greenspan used to vote first. So that, he made his views felt, and he would it's almost like bullying the others into following him in line. Ben Bernanke, when he came in, the first thing he said was, I will speak last. So I will listen to all of you. So I hope in your classrooms you're all Ben Bernankes and not, Alan Greenspans. I hope you don't say, I think today we are going to do inflation, and I think it should be headline inflation or core inflation.
And right now we all are behaving like students,
Yeah, oh, no. Yeah, so that's true, So, but here, what are the pros and cons? I think the problem with the CPI headline, which is why all of you are saying, is that CPI headline has oil and food prices, which you basically don't control. In India, the basket is about 50% oil and food. So, what's the point in having a target if you don't control 50% of the components of that target? And that's the argument for using the CPI core. Let me say, however, that most central banks actually target CPI headline. They don't target CPI core. And the reason is the following, that at the end of the day, it really depends upon what, consumers and agents in the economy are getting used to. Even in Delhi, you go, to, somewhere in one of these markets and say, daam kya hai? More likely he's going to say headline than core inflation. I'm sure he won't have a clue what core inflation is. And since all this is so much about, what communication you have to do, what people understand about prices and about the way the economy works, I think therefore most central banks choose headline inflation. It's easier to communicate, and also because of that reason, because also remember that as savers, remember the financial savings channel of transmission. As savers, we are much more concerned with headline CPI, because the savings in our thing is going to be determined, the value of our savings is going to be determined more by overall inflation than by this. And therefore, and finally, I think if people focus on headline, inflation expectations are also going to be formed based on headline. And that's why I think that, but it's not an open and shut case by any means. I mean, the argument that you don't control 50%, therefore, what's the point in targeting that is an interesting and important point to take into account. But I think that this is why, you have this balance to be struck, arguments on both sides, and again, very good. Okay, what about the level? So now we've decided it should be CPI, say, by the way, the Indian law says CPI headline, not CPI core. And then the question is, what should be the level of this? Should it be 0? Should it be 2? Should it be 4, 6? You know what the Indian law says? The Indian law says 4 plus or minus 2%. So you can go down to 2, you can go up to 6, but you cannot exceed this. But most central banks in advanced countries choose 2. And as I said, completely accidentally, some dinner conversation somewhere in New Zealand led to 2%, and then then we all, like herd behavior, other countries followed that. And see, just to give you a sense of why it wasn't 0%, some people, when they were talking about this, Paul Volcker, for example, he said a very strong believer that the target should be, the level should be no more than 0.5%, because there are some people who believe that price stability is very, very important for investment decisions. Firms and consumers should not have to worry about price changes, because if you have constant prices, no inflation, the whole mentality of how we think, how we plan could be helped quite a bit. That was the argument. But the counter argument to that was, and it was very, very, great foresight there. The argument for having some inflation like 2% was, people said, oh my God, what happens if you have such a bad recession that you have to bring rates down? Then you may need negative real interest rates. So if you have 0% inflation, all you can do is to get the interest rate down to 0, and you can't punch into the economy by having negative real interest rates. In fact, and that turned out to be a very thing, because exactly what happened. Remember, after the global financial crisis, all interest rates have come down to 0, and you still find economies still having a lot of difficulty, still high unemployment and so on. So that's why I think that more and more there's now discussion that maybe even the advanced economies should go to higher interest rates. Now, why have we chosen 2%, 4% in India? I don't think this is, this was part of the Urjit Patel report. Essentially, a country like India, for example, right? We are going to be growing faster than advanced economies. So a rough rule of thumb is that our productivity growth, because we are poorer, remember convergence, go back to convergence, we're poorer, we're going to grow faster. Our productivity growth is going to be greater. So if our productivity growth is 2% greater than that in advanced countries, then we can have 2% higher inflation, and exchange rate doesn't have to change very much. So remember, the more inflation you have, the more you become uncompetitive. But if you have productivity growth alongside, you offset that. So 2% inflation, 2% productivity growth extra relative to other countries means you can be competitive without changing your exchange rate. And that's why broadly we've chosen 4%. I think you could make the case that India productivity growth is going to be much more rapid, and therefore you could have a slightly higher inflation target. But that's kind of a marginal decision. But the underlying thing is that if you going to have higher productivity growth, you can afford to have consistently higher inflation without losing competitiveness. Okay, what about the institutional arrangements? We all know that all of this happened, so I've spoken about inflation targeting, giving primacy to the objective of inflation over other objectives. Second, I think a point I haven't emphasized enough is it was also about, business cycles, inflation business cycles, and the point that you raised earlier, that just as you have political business cycles on fiscal policy, you can also have political business cycles on inflation. I think governments might be tempted to put juice into the economy just before elections. It could lead to high inflation, which of course turns out to be bad for the economy. And therefore, giving someone else the independence and the freedom, the pre-commit governments basically pre-commit. They take the Bhishma vow and say, I am not going to get involved in inflation. We're going to give it to an independent central bank. So inflation targeting also arose out of a need for the government to get out of this business and give it to an independent institution so that politics could be kept out of this process. And then of course, you try and institutionalize that by having this in the law. So now, for example, the Indian law says the central bank has this objective and it will have to meet this target that we've set for the central bank. And the way, of course, in India, the way it works now is that we have a monetary policy committee which decides. Earlier it used to be, basically the governor of the central bank deciding it. And I think the reason is that, if you have more views, you have better decision making instead of one view prevailing. This is a little bit the Alan Greenspan, Ben Bernanke kind of situation. You want there to be a wide range of views expressed. And in India, the way it works is that the 3 MPC members from the RBI, including the governor, there are 3 from outside appointed by the government in consultation with the RBI. And if there's a tie, the governor has a casting vote. Of course, I think we've had 5 monetary policy committee meetings, except in the very last one where one person dissented, it was 5-1. We've had unanimous decision 6-0. You have to, decide whether that's why that's happened, but that's the way it's been set up in India. And then accountability. So if you give someone, it's like if in India, if you create a regulatory institution and give it independence, but it cannot be independence, untrammeled independence. You have to be accountable as well. And so, because after all, it's the political executive that's created this institution. Therefore, it cannot be that finally, in some ways, the independent institution is not answerable to the political process at some point. And I think that, so the way it's been set up in our monetary policy in the legislation is that in the event that, for 3 consecutive quarters, if there's any deviation from the target, then the central bank has to specify the reason and suggest remedial actions. In the United Kingdom, this used to happen quite a bit, where the governor, then Governor Mervyn King, used to, they would miss these targets, because in many central banks, they have consistently missed the target on the downside, i.e. they have a target of 2% and they've consistently underachieved that, been below 2% for a very, very long time after the global financial crisis. So they've had to write these letters and, writing letters, it didn't do very much finally. It's taken them a long time to get back to their inflation target. Now, of course, a part of the institutional mechanisms also means that you should have more transparency, where the central bank explains its actions to the public. One of the things that's missing from this bullet point, Abhishek, important one that's missing, is that the discussions of the meeting are now made public. The minutes of the meeting are made public with I think a 2-week lag or something like that, so that we get to know what the thinking is, and in that sense, and then if they know that what they're going to say is going to become public, then of course I think in some ways you could argue that it makes for a richer discussion, a more transparent discussion, and this is part of the institutional arrangements. We've done this. Okay.
But this MPC minutes, the name of the member?
Yeah, with the name. So you will know what, who spoke what. Now, finally, I think that here's a quiz for you. Supposing inflation rises to 7% or inflation falls to 2%, what should the RBI do? Whatever you say is the wrong answer, but but that's not what I'm going to say. And a bit of so here's something that is a very important point about inflation control and the transmission of monetary policy, because remember, this says that you're basically trying to drive ahead, looking at the rear view mirror. Now, the fact that today inflation is above target or below target, in principle, is almost not completely, but it's almost irrelevant. Why is that? Because
Data is old, like at least
Expectations.
2 months back.
data is old, expectations.
Effect lag.
So I think here it is. So remember that the transmission mechanism from policy to whatever outcome, there are lags. So there's a famous statement about monetary policy having long and variable lags in terms of its impact, right? So in an inflation targeting regime, Actually, very important. You don't target inflation, you actually target your inflation forecast, because that's what you're committing to meet. So today inflation may be 7% or 2%, but what the central bank has to do is to say, I think that my policies work with 6 or 9 month lag. For that 6 or 9 months, this is my inflation forecast, and therefore, what do I need to do to get that in line with whatever target that you have? So in that sense, therefore, when you think about inflation, monetary policy, it must be forward-looking. In principle, what has happened in the past may or may not be relevant. What you're looking at is the future. And by the way, again, going back to a question that was asked, these are all things that are not, this is not science, because we don't really know how long it takes if I cut interest rates. Think of this, I cut interest rates, i.e. the central bank. When will it be passed through by the banks? We don't know. How will investors and consumers view that? Then they make their decision, and then it affects the economy, and so on and so forth. Each of these steps, we don't really know how long it's going to take and how much effect it will have.
When we are looking at that 6 to 9 month period ahead,
yeah,
is it not the idea that we are anchoring expectations rather than?
Yeah, so a very good point. Yes, you set it, you anchor expectations, but if you don't meet them, then your expectations process can go unhinged. So you have to, that's exactly why you have a forecast, but then you have to be able to meet that consistently. Or at least, even if you make errors, it should be on, within and small and on both sides, not one side. Yeah, sorry.
If inflation is largely structural and supply side, I don't know what your sense is about that, as opposed to demand, what is your sense for how much of an impact demand side monetary policy can actually have in an economy like India?
So, part of the thing we touched upon, so the question is, if you have a lot of structural factors affecting inflation, how does the transmission work? Because you act only on the remaining part. See, remember we discussed that structural factors, unless they are repeated, they should be kind of one-off level effects rather than consistent effects. If they are consistent effects, then by definition, it's not monetary policy that will cure it. You have to do agricultural reform, whatever, right? So that's taken out of the equation. But it's true that in terms of when you assess the impact of your action, you will probably take into account more what you can affect rather than what you can't affect, and then factor that into. So between the action and the inflation forecast must be consistent. I think that's the key point. Good monetary policy requires sophisticated, of course, model-based, and to guide expectations, as you said. But finally, economic models aren't perfect. The future is difficult to think. That's why it requires a lot of judgment, and that's why I think the whole having a committee, having the Ben Bernanke approach as opposed to the Alan Greenspan approach could also be very important. You get a diversity of views, and then of course finally you have to have a picture of your God of your choice. Finally, whether you meet it or not consistently, it's going to be. But I think over time, institutionalizing this process, building up over time a reputation for meeting this, then can create a stable price situation where things it helps the economy quite a lot finally. But I want to leave you with a final point before I conclude, that now inflation targeting is a concept that's being very critically reviewed and evaluated in advanced economies as well. Now, I think, my own feeling is that, these things kind of work in cycles. That we had a long period of very high inflation, so the world reacted to that and said we must have inflation targeting. Then when the global financial crisis hit, we're in a completely different kind of macroeconomic environment where the problem is not, I mean, the problem is deflation. In Japan has had deflation for 2 decades, and even the US in advanced economies. So in a sense, the monetary policy framework of that past has actually been overtaken by events. And in practice, that's why central banks around the world have started doing all kinds of things that would have seemed crazy, in 1980 or 1990. So in fact, now there is a review of all of this. One example, sir, as you mentioned, is that people think that maybe fiscal policy and monetary policy should coordinate much more in order to, get the economy going again. Another idea is that advanced economies should have inflation targets not of 2% but of 4%, so that when the economy gets bad, you have, if your nominal interest rate can go to 0, you can get negative real interest rates of 4%, which could give much more demand boost to the economy as well. And of course, the latest ideas, things like people are saying we should not target inflation, but maybe you should target nominal GDP. Because what has happened, there's been insufficiency of demand, and if you want to really stabilize the economy, we should target other things. So the whole thing is kind of being reevaluated because circumstances have changed. John Maynard Keynes had a famous line. Someone asked him, why he changed his mind. He said, "The facts have changed. I have changed my mind. What do you do, sir?" So the question is, similarly, the facts have changed, the world is changing, but in some ways for us, we still have this legacy of the high inflation era. For about 6-7 years, we had high inflation. I think we're trying to tame that and create a system where, a macroeconomic environment where prices are more stable, which will be then good for the economy as a whole. So with that, I think we're bang on target, 4:10. My voice is telling me that I should stop, but I'm happy to take questions as well.
Sir, one question, please. So what's your viewpoint on 0% interest rate in the context of India?
0% interest rate. The question is, why not have 0% interest rate in India? We're having difficulty going from 6.25% to 6% and 5.5%. Don't make me fantasize. This is I'm still fantasizing about 5.5% and 6% interest rates. This would be too much. Even I couldn't handle it.
Some slide of that, sir, complete various stakeholders and then related to interest. Can we have the slide so the question is there?
Oh, you want a question? But you have now, you have the soft copy and the hard copy of that. So,
yes,
yeah.
Can I have one?
Yes.
Yeah, one at a time. First, let him, yeah.
Sir, if you look into your preference list, it is clear-cut only the household sector is looking for high interest rates. And even within household sectors, those who are borrowers, consumer goods and other loan borrowers, they will prefer lower interest rate. So overall, if you look into the entire economy-wide, more or less every group is looking for the low interest rate. So I think low interest rate should be the target when by the everyone.
No, but of course, it's a very good point. But of course, the answer here is that if you want to have low inflation, the RBI, which is powerful than all of these put together, you should have the RBI here, and then for them, quite rightly, if you have high inflation, you have to have high interest rates. Yeah. It's a good point, but remember, you do need monetary control and inflation control. So let's. Yeah, you had a question. I'll come to you. Don't worry. Today I will not neglect you.
I think this preference for high or low interest rate among households would also depend on the age structure of population.
Correct, absolutely. I mean, if you're older, you're a saver, and then exactly. If you're young, you borrow more. That's a very good point. So, see, this is exactly what you should do. You should take this table, go to Excel, and create another row: households old, households young, so that's See, I'm serious. This is the kind of thing. This is exactly the kind of thing that these devices are for. To provoke, to make it much better, more complete than what we've put up here. Yeah. Are there any? See, I've been told I'm neglecting the northeast and northwest. Yeah. So yeah, please. Yeah. Yes. Center. Let me. Center. Please give him the.
Hello. So we ended up saying that the monetary policy has to be forward-looking approach. But if you see the agents in the economy, for example, firms, individuals, consumers, they form the expectations which are more of adaptive kind of behavior they show. So in that case, the trade-off between inflation and output becomes very much sharp, and that is the policy making become difficult. So in that case, what is your view?
Very good point. That's a very good point. That in fact, in the 70s, this was exactly the kind of debate that took place, that people found that people had very adaptive expectations. Now, the downside is that because people have adaptive expectations, if there's high inflation in the past, that can become persistent. So one of the reasons why you want to make this forward-looking, the point that you said about creating expectations, is precisely to break that kind of thing, because adaptive expectations can actually make. So, for example, in Latin America during the 70s, they had 5,000, 10,000% inflation, and therefore you think that if you have 5,000, you will continue to have high inflation. Wages responded to that. That kept increasing prices. So, in fact, the whole turn towards inflation targeting is in fact to break those adaptive expectations in a high inflation environment. Always now the North is going to get preference here. There are two. I'm not going to neglect you today.
Sir, my question is regarding the Monetary Policy Committee. That as we know that RBI has to be very independent while formulating of monetary policy, where we have 3 nominees from the government. So, do you think the government influence is now increased?
You look at the voting record, my friend, it's 6-0, 6-0, 6-0. So, no, but the thing is that, remember that those appointments are made in consultation with the RBI, and very much the aim is to get, people who are technical experts on this, and then, so that you have a, because you want to have so the gentleman here said that there has to be someone who represents these interests, because you can't have someone just the RBI. No, I'm joking, but the things that you want technical expertise, you want outsiders to have to reflect broader interests as well. And in practice, I think it finally doesn't have to be RBI, government, etc. It has to be based on assessments, technical assessments of inflation going forward and so on. There was a question there, and then we'll come to you. Yeah.
So my question is, suppose there is an economy where we have independent and credible central banks. Do you think while targeting inflation targeting, we can follow a cold turkey strategy? Do you think that?
Cold turkey strategy meaning?
Meaning you reduce your interest rate and at one go.
See, but remember, credibility is a very fragile thing. If you acquire credibility, then you have to maintain credibility. If you just do cold turkey and then inflation picks up again, you lose that credibility. So essentially, credibility is about doing the right thing given the circumstances, and then you can build on that credibility. But you can lose it very easily if you just do cold turkey. Yeah.
How would you think WPI is? How would measure is WPI for forward inflation targeting?
Yeah. So they had this debate between WPI and this, and it was felt that WPI was unduly influenced by international prices. One thing, and WPI doesn't have services at all. So if you wanted a broad-based measure, the WPI, that's why the RBI used to, wanted, and that's why they switched to the CPI. Yeah.
So inflation targeting, I think it can help for the growth also, but poverty also can be reduced, and we have seen it. But can it help to reduce the inequality of income? Because mostly I have observed that in the market, The borrowers are from share market, agents, capitalists. They all are getting the benefits of the borrowing. And on the other side, households who are from the lower middle class and poor, they are the savers. So you tell me that how actually inequality of income can be reduced. I mean, how inflation targeting can help to achieve this objective.
See, I think that, one should be careful about overburdening, inflation, monetary policy with all kinds of objectives. You have one instrument, and please don't overload it with achieving inflation, achieving employment, achieving whatever. So it's one instrument that controls inflation and aggregate demand. It turns out that high inflation affects the poor more adversely. So in that sense, there is a confluence of interest between having inflation targeting and protecting the poor against one thing. See, there are so many sources of inequality. I mean, inflation is going to, at best, affect one component of that. That's why I think we should be careful about, expecting too much out of monetary policy. I think this gentleman has never asked a question yet.
This is a general question. How do we incorporate the market imperfection? Because the entire these premises are based on Washington consensus, because there is just complete market. But we are not incorporating the market imperfections. And this market imperfection is leading to many things. There are many theories that develop, like this Stiglitz says you need a very customized type of the model. And we are deviating and we are more coupling the market. These are interlinking market.
See, but
so how do we incorporate, or how RBI is ready? Because most of the people who are policymaker now, they are blindly following the Washington consensus. This is the 10 principles, and this entire market.
So I think, we have to have one debate on the Washington consensus and this. But speaking to monetary policy, remember that all central banks have inflation models. Now, that inflation model will be built on Indian data, take into account all these rigidities, this, that, and the other. So wanting to have low inflation has nothing to do with the Washington consensus. If the model is a kind of American model, then your critique would be very valid. But I'm sure that when they build their models, it takes into account, we have agriculture, and therefore, we have imperfect markets, our financial markets are less developed. So all those, I think, will be built into the model that they build, and in terms of the assessments they make of how this will work. So I think that's not a totally a kind of fair critique of this, that this particular process, because I think all these local variants, local particularities should be built in, and probably are built in to the kinds of models of inflation that the RBI uses. Yeah, exactly. I think that, if you don't mind, see, so the only concession I will make is to my friend, otherwise he'll go. So you have the last word, sir. You have the last word, sir. Give him the mic.
Okay, so my question is that, as you said that most of Indian inflation, when the inflation was high, it was because of iron and food crisis, food supply side problem. How much those things can be controlled by inflation targeting, and the RBI does not have anything to do with the iron prices or food production or food import, export?
See, but I thought I answered that question. They went up once, they didn't keep going up, but our inflation kept being high. So something that we did, so now you've had your, now is my answer, and then we stop. So oil prices go up, food prices go up, there is an impact. We don't control that.
RBI
Huh?
RBI
Yeah, I mean the monetary authorities don't control that, but they do control whatever inflation expectations that get built after that, and we have to therefore try and control those inflation expectations. And what monetary policy does, by setting a low inflation target, it tries to influence that. Also by acting, by raising interest rates. Also, you convince people that that inflation target and expectation is going to be consistent with what you control. So, in fact, the reason we have inflation targeting is because even though the shock was temporary, inflation became permanent. And that's what we're trying to control here. So with the
10:30.
tomorrow is 10 o'clock, right?